Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video, I'd like to discuss the latest on the tariff situation with electric vehicles scheduled to come online from the end of this year. UK government are very keen for the grace periods to be extended, as are some in the EU, including, of course, major car manufacturers. And now it seems that there might be a breakthrough that could offer some postponement of the problem, maybe even ending the problem, albeit for a shorter period than we would like. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel. So I've discussed this issue a few times recently. It's not only, a moving news story, fast moving, because there's a bit of a timer on this, but it's incredibly important to the Brexit narrative. Put simply, according to the Trade and Cooperation Agreement negotiated and signed by Boris Johnson at the beginning of 2024, the rules of origin become more difficult to meet for electric vehicles produced in both the EU and the UK. By more difficult, I mean impossible. Not in the future, but right now. The upshot of this is that if any electric vehicles are exported from Britain to the EU or from the EU to Britain from next year, 10% tariffs would apply. And the reason for this is because we cannot consider that enough of the car has been made in our respective market because of the difficulty getting cells and components for electric cells. Now, this would not mean that car manufacturers would find they'd find their cars more expensive in the other market. That would hit productivity because then, if something's 10% more expensive, all of a sudden, are you going to buy it? Moves towards the electrification of our economy, they get hit. But it also exposes the lies from the Tories about the Brexit deal being tariff-free, because the impact would be so severe for British car manufacturing in this country, there would be no hiding it. This is why Sunak has been pushing very hard for a postponement of the term for 3 years. Now, he doesn't care about the economic impact. We can clearly see that from his behaviour in the last week. It's the political impact of threats to jobs in key areas in an industry that became very closely associated with Brexit. There was a similar push from EU car manufacturers as well, of course. They don't fancy 10% tariffs on their products any more than British-based manufacturers, as well as, of course, politicians whom they have successfully lobbied. But there was resistance, or in fact there still is resistance, amongst some in the EU Commission. Thierry Breton and Maros Šefčovič, for example, had argued that the Brexit deal shouldn't be chopped and changed for the sake of short-term considerations, that the level playing field had to be maintained in the interests of the integrity of the single market. And this is a fair argument. It's worth bearing in mind, Brexit did not occur when we left the EU in January 2020, or even when we left the single market and customs union in January 2021. We are still carrying it out in a series of bite-sized stages in order to prevent people in Britain seeing the full horror of what they voted for in one fell swoop. Classic frog in boiling pot strategy. There are still more stages of Brexit to go through. And the grace periods that we agreed in order to lessen the blow are technically special arrangements for the UK. These are trading advantages which other countries do not get to enjoy without formal treaties. They're allowing us special terms without really having much in the way of obligations in return. But the EU is pragmatic, and there are two problems with going ahead with these tariffs for the EU itself. First, it will be harmful to some major and influential EU-based businesses. Thierry Breton made the point that car manufacturers are not the entire car supply chain, which is absolutely true, but they are major employers, and significant job losses associated with a downturn would be big, unpopular news in Europe. Second, the EU wants to compete with China and the USA on electrification technology. Anything which hits production in this area is not really conducive to that. Just as we keep trying to explain to the boneheads supporting Brexit that our industrial allies are in Europe, not to be found anywhere else, because only local supply chains can ever be efficient enough to compete on the world stage, so too the logic holds for the EU. Britain is a much smaller market than the EU, but it's still a big chunk of that supply chain. And it doesn't matter that trade barriers are a bigger loss for the UK. It's a loss for both sides, and a gain for competitors in Asia and North America. And so now Maros Shevchovich, who's one of those who was resisting, and still is, to be fair, resisting changes to the Brexit deal, has said there's an argument for redefining what made in Europe means. Now, this is a compromise that would not require a rewriting of the trade and cooperation agreement as such. It just changes the definitions which make up the rules of origin and therefore make the requirements easier to meet. It's the obvious pragmatic solution. It would still mean that if we fail rules of origin requirements, the 10% tariffs still apply. So we would still technically have tariffs on these goods if certain conditions are not met. It's just that we would be able to meet those conditions. That would make the issue largely moot. In terms of the immediate impact, it would result in at least a 1-year postponement, as I understand it, of the current arrangements. So that cliff edge at the end of this year would sort of go away. If this is agreed across the EU, Sunak would, of course, absolutely take it. You know, he'll be living in California a year later anyway, so it will suit him. It means that if this compromise only ends up kicking the can down the road for another year, it'll be Keir Starmer who has to deal with it, not him. That being said, as long as the EU always benefits at least as much as the UK from any sort of change of the definitions, then there's no reason to suppose we can't maintain tariff-free trade in practical terms for the long term on electric vehicles. Certainly long enough to rejoin the single market anyway. That will always be the trick. As I keep saying, the EU aren't going to do us favours. You know, this isn't about the EU doing us a favour. They're not tossing us a bone because we made arses of ourselves and they feel sorry for us. Any moves will be motivated by their own interests and our interests. They have to align. It's why we need to make sure that our interests align. The onus is on us to make sure that our interests align because we are always the worst affected. And this will be what Labour need to focus on in government. In the meantime, welcome news. It is worth pointing out that nothing has been agreed. We still only have a matter of weeks, really, to get it sorted. But this is the beauty of the EU on full show. It comes up with solutions to problems that don't involve chaotically ripping up agreements a few years after they were signed and changing it. It's another example of how EU bureaucracy, which is not a dirty term, is going to make trade easier and preserve jobs. And I think more emphasis needs to be made of that. This is an example of EU bureaucracy, and it's going to make trade easier and preserve jobs, as it always has. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, please click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, the join button for memberships. And until next time, I'll see you later.